She wore the uniform of a soldier, but in the eyes of a racist cop, her service meant nothing. In front of her daughter, on a live stream watched by millions, he raised his weapon. A single gunshot followed. The phone never dropped. Her silence became the scream that shook the nation. Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The phone camera flickered to life, shaky at first, then steady in Sarah Monroe's hands. She wore her fatigue uniform, the desert tan patches catching the morning light. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't protesting. Her voice was calm, measured, the way a soldier trained to face chaos might sound. Her daughter Eden, just 8 years old, clung to her side, her small hand buried in the fabric of her mother's sleeve. "Stay close, baby," Sarah whispered, not to the audience who would soon multiply by the thousands, but to the trembling child who looked up at her with wide, searching eyes. The cop stood just a few feet away. His hand was already on his holstered weapon, his stance rigid, his jaw clenched, as though her existence itself was an act of defiance. His voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Kneel down, now." The words weren't a request, they were a command, barked like she was an enemy combatant, not a citizen, not a decorated soldier who had served 3 tours overseas. Sarah didn't flinch. Her phone, balanced against her car hood, caught the stillness of her frame, the slight wind lifting her braids from her shoulders. Her voice was firm, stripped of anger, but grounded in authority. "I serve. I don't kneel." It was not a challenge, it was a statement. Her discipline held her spine straight, even as the tension grew thicker. Eden tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering so faintly it almost disappeared into the hum of traffic. "Mom?" The livestream comments began trickling in, numbers rising on the side of the screen. Viewers didn't yet know they were watching history unfold. Some asked what was happening, some begged her to comply, others urged her to keep standing, as if their typed words could shield her from the man in front of her. The cop's hand tightened on the grip of his gun. He shouted again, louder, his voice cracking with the frustration of being defied. "On your knees, now!" Sarah didn't move. She had faced worse threats, worse weapons, worse men who thought fear alone could break her. Her body radiated calm resolve, though her daughter's grip trembled against her skin. She bent slightly, whispering again to Eden. "Don't be afraid. I've got you." The seconds dragged on, each one stretching like a wire pulled too tight. The live stream continued, the camera unwavering, its unblinking eye capturing every breath, every twitch, every ounce of mounting dread. Then, as if inevitability had been waiting in the shadows, the cop's gun cleared the holster. Time slowed in ways that felt impossible. Sarah's breath steadied, her shoulders squared, her voice clear enough to cut through the air and into the memory of everyone watching. "I serve," she repeated, softer now but with iron in every syllable. "I don't kneel." The shot tore through the morning, a single crack that silenced everything. Sarah jerked once, her body folding inward like a paper figure collapsing in the wind. Her knees hit the ground, not in surrender, but in the final weight of gravity claiming her. Eden's scream shattered the silence, a raw, piercing cry that no one who heard it would ever forget. The phone didn't fall, it stayed fixed, its lens holding steady as if refusing to look away. The live stream carried the image unbroken, Sarah lying motionless on the pavement, her child's tiny body shaking against her side, the smoke still rising from the cop's weapon. Comments exploded across the feed, flooding the screen in real time. "He shot her, she was unarmed, oh my God." Some typed prayers, some typed curses. Some simply typed her name as if calling it might wake her. The officer shouted into his radio, his voice frantic now, words clipped and distorted. "Shots fired, civilian down, request backup." His own body shook, the hand gripping his gun twitching as if even he couldn't believe what he had done. But the internet believed. The proof was right there, playing live for anyone with a screen. Within minutes, the feed had been captured, shared, duplicated across TikTok, Twitter, YouTube. The world didn't wait for an explanation. The world had seen. By the time paramedics arrived, sirens wailing, the footage had already been clipped and edited into sound bites. Someone added the national anthem over it, the words, "Oh say can you see," echoing against the image of Sarah's fall. Others paired the silence after the gunshot with hashtags that spread like wildfire. Her badge, her blood. Silent salute. Eden's voice kept breaking through, sobbing, calling, "Mom! Mom!" Her small hands pressed desperately against her mother's still chest, as if sheer will could restart a heart. The cop paced, his face pale, his lips moving as though he were reciting a script to himself. The ambulance doors slammed, and Eden was pulled away, screaming, as her mother's body was lifted onto the stretcher. But the camera stayed, still rolling, until a gloved hand finally reached over and shut it off. By then it was too late. The world had already seen more than enough. The first official police statement came hours later. A spokesperson stood at a podium, eyes glazed with rehearsed detachment. The words were predictable, the cadence familiar. An unclear threat was neutralized. Neutralized, as though Sarah had been a weapon instead of a woman. As though her daughter's scream wasn't echoing across every corner of the internet. The phrase was repeated by news anchors, their voices steady, their expressions controlled, as if the script was designed to dull the edges of what millions had already witnessed. But the livestream refused to be silenced. Every contradiction, every attempt at spin, was drowned beneath the weight of undeniable truth. People reposted the video with side-by-side comparisons of the police statement and the footage. The lie unraveled in real time. Soldiers at bases across the country gathered in silence, staring at the video playing on loop in break rooms and barracks. Their uniforms suddenly felt heavier, their medals suddenly meaningless. One soldier, eyes fixed on the frozen frame of Sarah's last stand, muttered words that captured what so many felt. If they can kill her, the uniform means nothing. It wasn't said with anger. It was said with the hollow ache of betrayal, the recognition that loyalty was a currency no longer honored. For years, soldiers had saluted the flag, believing it saluted them back. Now, that belief lay bleeding on the pavement. With Sarah Monroe, public reaction fractured along familiar lines. Some argued she should have complied, should have knelt, should have obeyed, as if obedience could guarantee survival. Others saw her refusal as the truest act of patriotism, that a soldier sworn to defend freedom should never bow to injustice at home. In living rooms, classrooms, churches, and town halls, people watched the footage again and again. Each viewing pulled the nation deeper into its wound. Was this what service meant? Was this what the flag demanded? That its defenders bow not to enemies abroad, but to prejudice at home. By nightfall, protests had already begun. Candles lined sidewalks. Posters read her words. "I serve. I don't kneel." The image of Sarah standing tall in her uniform became a symbol, not just of defiance, but of dignity. Stolen in broad daylight. Her name was no longer just Sarah Monroe. It was a rallying cry, a reminder, a fracture, and a question that burned through every community, every screen, every soul. If service couldn't protect her, what could protect anyone? In the hours after the shooting, Eden sat in a small, dimly lit waiting room at the hospital. Her hands were sticky, stained with her mother's blood. She did not cry. She did not speak. She simply stared down at the cracked phone clutched tightly in her grip, Sarah's phone, the one that had captured everything. The live stream had stopped, but the recording was still there, saved to memory, unshakable, undeniable. A nurse tried to coax her into letting go of it, but Eden's grip only tightened. She pressed the device against her chest like a lifeline, her small shoulders rising and falling with uneven breaths. Every time the door creaked, she flinched, Every time footsteps passed in the hall, her eyes darted up, hopeful, only to fall again when she saw no one she knew. She was 8 years old, but in that room she looked both younger and impossibly older, as if grief had aged her overnight. Words failed her. Silence was all she had, and that silence carried the unbearable weight of what she had witnessed. The phone screen lit up once, showing a missed call, then dimmed again. Eden barely blinked. She was locked inside herself. Inside the last image of her mother standing tall, inside the sound of that single shot. Meanwhile, outside the walls of the hospital, the internet was anything but silent. An anonymous editor, no name, no profile photo, took Sarah's live stream and cut it into something that spread faster than anyone could have imagined. The video began with Sarah standing firm, her voice steady as she declared, "I serve. I don't kneel." Then the anthem swelled, the familiar notes of the Star-Spangled Banner rising beneath her words. The image froze for just a moment on her upright frame, the flag patch on her shoulder bright and clear. Then the gunshot cut through the music, shattering the anthem into silence. The edit went viral within hours. Millions watched, millions wept. Veterans saluted their screens. Teenagers uploaded reaction videos, their faces wet with tears. Some whispered prayers, others shouted rage. Some just stared, their voices gone, their silence speaking louder than words. Eden still didn't know. She had no idea that the whole world was watching her mother's last stand. She had no idea that strangers across the country were sharing her mother's voice, her mother's words, her mother's defiance. All she knew was the quiet hum of the hospital, the cold air of the waiting room, and the weight of the phone she refused to release. In the corner of the room, a social worker whispered to another staff member, "She hasn't said a single word." The reply was just as hushed. "She doesn't have to. That silence, it says everything." Outside, silence was beginning to take shape in ways no one had expected. The first vigil happened that very night. No one organized it, no one called for it. People simply showed up. At the courthouse steps, where so many protests had been marked by chants and bullhorns, this gathering was different. Men and women held candles, their faces lit by the soft glow of flame. Children clutched their parents' hands, their eyes wide and solemn. There were no speeches, no slogans, no chants, just silence. The silence spread quickly, not as absence but as presence, a new kind of language. People stood shoulder to shoulder, unmoving, each minute of stillness declaring louder than any shouted demand, "We saw, we know, we will not forget." The anthem edit played on loop in the minds of those who stood there, though no music was played aloud. People had watched it enough times that they could feel the rhythm of it in their bones. Sarah's words, her defiance, the shot, the silence. And now here, in the still air of the vigil, that silence lived on. The stillness spread further than the courthouse. Across military bases, soldiers gathered in barracks and break rooms, passing phones hand to hand, showing the video over and over. Some slammed fists into walls, rage too big to contain. Some wept quietly, heads bowed into their hands. Some sat frozen, unable to look away, unable to move. Whispers rippled like wildfire across the ranks. "They shot one of us." It was more than shock. It was betrayal. For years, service members had carried the weight of loyalty, trusting the nation to honor their sacrifice. Now they watched one of their own, in uniform, gunned down in broad daylight on American soil, not by an enemy abroad, but by a man sworn to serve and protect. For many, it was the first time they questioned not just their safety, but the meaning of the uniform itself. If Sarah's service had not protected her, what did their own service mean? If her medals and tours couldn't shield her, what could shield them? Letters began to surface too. Reporters dug into Sarah's record, her deployments, her commendations. Her fellow soldiers spoke up, some on record, some anonymously. They described a woman who carried others out of firefights, who treated wounds under fire, who never hesitated to step into danger if it meant saving a life. "She carried me when I couldn't walk," one soldier wrote in a letter that was shared widely online. "She dragged me across sand with bullets flying. I wouldn't be alive if not for her. And now she's gone because she stood up on her own street? Because she wouldn't kneel?" Each testimony added to the unbearable gap between the woman Sarah was and the way her life had ended. The more people learned about her service, the harder it became to reconcile it with the footage of her death. Her silence at the courthouse, her refusal to kneel, had been her final salute, and now, across the nation, silence became the protest in her name. In neighborhoods and towns far from where Sarah had fallen, people gathered in living rooms, church basements, and community centers. They watched the video again, not because they wanted to, but because they couldn't stop. Each replay deepened the wound, each replay widened the fracture. Children saw it and asked questions their parents couldn't answer. Why did they hurt her? She didn't do anything. Parents fumbled for words, their voices breaking, because how could they explain the unexplainable? The silence of the vigil spread into homes, classrooms, sanctuaries. Teachers dimmed lights and played the anthem, edit before allowing students to sit quietly, heads bowed, some crying, some staring into the distance. Pastors stopped sermons halfway through, inviting their congregations to sit in silence instead of hearing more words. Families lit candles at their dinner tables, the flames flickering as their food grew cold, none of them eating, none of them speaking. The silence was not empty, it was full of rage, grief, disbelief, love. It carried Sarah's voice within it, her words echoing like a vow: "I serve, I don't kneel." Back at the bases, the silence was unbearable. Young soldiers whispered their fears, their voices tight. "If they can kill her, they can kill us. What's the point of this uniform?" Older veterans shook their heads, tears sliding down hardened faces. One slammed his fist into a table, shattering his coffee cup, muttering, "She saved lives overseas, and this is how they thank her?" Journalists continued uncovering her record. A Bronze Star, multiple commendations, photographs of her smiling with fellow soldiers, dust clinging to her uniform, her arms slung around a wounded comrade she had pulled from the line of fire. Every detail added weight to the silence. Every medal, every ribbon, every sacrifice magnified the injustice of her death. And then there were the personal stories, shared by those who had fought beside her. A medic described how Sarah had shielded him from gunfire with nothing but her body armor. A squad leader recalled how she had carried a wounded Afghan child miles to safety. Over and over, the same words appeared in letters, in interviews, in testimonies. "She saved me, she saved us, she saved lives." The contrast was unbearable. The woman who had risked everything to preserve life had been killed without hesitation. The soldier who stood firm in war zones had been gunned down on her own street. The patriot who carried the flag into battle had been denied its protection at home. The silence grew heavier with every revelation. Vigils swelled, more candles, more bowed heads, more stillness that spoke louder than shouting ever could. For Eden, still sitting in the hospital, still clutching her mother's phone, that silence pressed down like a weight she could not yet understand. The whole world was holding its breath for her mother, but for her, it was simpler, more devastating. It was waiting for a voice that would never answer her again. The morning after the vigils, a new wave of outrage spread, not through chance or silence, but through evidence. Someone leaked training tapes from the local police department. At first, the footage looked routine. A group of officers seated in a training room, screens glowing, coffee cups scattered across desks. But then the words began. One officer, leaning back with a smirk, laughed as he dismissed a question about soldiers. "If she's a black woman with a kid, she's bluffing. Don't fall for the uniform. They wear it for sympathy." The room chuckled. Another voice chimed in, mocking, "Discount soldier act. The badge will always win." The footage showed more than ignorance. It revealed a culture. Trainers mocked soldier protocol. dismissing the idea that veterans could pose a threat worth respecting. Instead of teaching restraint or de-escalation, the room buzzed with bravado, sneers, and laughter. When the tapes hit the internet, outrage doubled overnight. People froze the screen on the smirking faces, matching them to patrol officers they knew by sight. Mothers pointed at the video with shaking hands. Veterans cursed under their breath. Students replayed it in disbelief, asking aloud how the same people who swore to protect could mock those who fought for the nation. Families watching in their living rooms shook their heads. "This isn't training," one father muttered, holding his son close. "This is poison." Clips of the training spread across social media feeds, intercut with the viral anthem edit. Sarah's defiant voice, "I serve, I don't kneel," played against the officers' laughter, the contrast devastating. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. A woman who had served with honor gunned down by men who mocked service as a punchline. The department scrambled to deny the leak's authenticity, but the timestamps, the familiar faces, and the uniformed trainers were undeniable. The truth had been caught on their own cameras. In the silence of her hospital waiting room, Eden still clutched her mother's phone, unaware that the world outside was learning just how deliberate, how preventable, and how contemptuous her mother's death truly was. What had begun as grief was now hardening into fury. The second blow came in the form of screenshots. Internal group chats between officers surfaced, posted anonymously on forums, and quickly confirmed by independent outlets. The words were worse than the training tapes. One message read, "Discount GI, Jane thinks she's somebody." Another officer replied with laughing emojis and the words, "Parade clown in camo." Others piled on, mocking her for being a mother, for being black, for daring to stand tall in uniform. The most haunting line was one officer sneering, "She wants to play soldier? Let's see how she plays dead." The screenshots tore away the last shred of plausible deniability. This wasn't a tragic accident, wasn't the result of confusion in the moment. It was systemic bias, entrenched, shared in private, rewarded with laughter. The officers hadn't just disrespected Sarah after her death. They had mocked her before it happened. Public outrage roared, hashtags exploded. "Not an accident" trended alongside justice for Sarah. Veterans joined civilians in condemning the words, their anger carrying the weight of shared service and sacrifice. Families of soldiers, watching the thread spread across their screens, shook their heads in disbelief. One mother whispered to her husband, "You can't spin blood. You can't excuse this." In living rooms, people read the chats aloud and felt their stomachs twist. The venom in the words was undeniable. It was not a mistake of one bad officer. It was proof of a culture where contempt had grown unchecked. At news desks, journalists held the screenshots against official statements from the department. Every denial, every claim of respect for veterans collapsed under the weight of their own private words. On panel shows, commentators tried to shape the narrative. Conservative pundits declared, "She escalated, she disrespected authority." But their voices faltered as clips of the chats played side by side with Sarah's service record. Others pushed back firmly. "She was murdered in uniform. There is no other way to describe it." The public, watching from couches and phones, knew where they stood. As one grieving father of a deployed Marine told a reporter, "When the blood is real, when the bullets are real, you don't get to call her a clown. She carried people out of gunfire." And they laughed. They laughed. Each revelation cracked the department's defenses wider. It wasn't just one officer. It wasn't just one decision. It was a culture of betrayal, receipts too clear to ignore. The firestorm forced its way into places that had tried to remain neutral. Military leadership, long cautious about stepping into civilian-police conflicts, could no longer stay silent. General Dalton, a career officer with decades of service, sat through a full briefing of the footage, the chats, the coverage. For a long stretch he said nothing. The room waited, tense, as the silence deepened. Finally his words cut sharp. The oath means nothing if the badge outguns it. The statement rippled out instantly. Though spoken in a closed room, it leaked, as things always do. Soon it was splashed across headlines, dissected on every channel. The oath means nothing if the badge outguns it. To service members, it was validation of what they already felt. To civilians, it was a chilling acknowledgement from the highest levels. Something was broken. The Pentagon itself had acknowledged a rupture. For Sarah's comrades, those who had once fought beside her, it was more than political. It was personal. They had stood with her under fire. They had trusted her with their lives. And now they saw her mocked, diminished, killed. The divide widened across the country. On one side were those who insisted on defending the badge, no matter the cost. On the other were those who knew the badge had dishonored the oath. In military bases, dining halls grew quiet as the word spread. The oath means nothing if the badge outguns it. Young soldiers repeated it like a mantra, their voices carrying both anger and grief. Some wrote it on cardboard signs and held them at vigils. Others spray-painted it on walls outside precincts. The phrase became a banner, a rallying cry for those who refused to let Sarah's name be forgotten. Even in Congress, voices began to stir. Lawmakers quoted Dalton's words, some with fury, some with shame. Hearings were demanded. In living rooms, veterans sat straighter, nodding. The fracture between service and civilian authority was no longer a whisper. It was open, undeniable, broadcast into every home. Sarah had stood alone in defiance. Now the highest levels of the military admitted that her defiance had meaning, that her stand revealed a truth too long buried. The narrative shifted again when veterans began to speak out in mass numbers. It started with a few posts, heartfelt, tagged with a simple phrase, "I served with Sarah." Then the flood came. Thousands of posts across platforms. Soldiers past and present writing not of politics, not of ideology, but of the woman they knew. A Marine described how Sarah had shielded him from a grenade blast, pushing him down and absorbing the shockwave with her own body armor. A medic told how she had given her own blood in a battlefield transfusion, her veins tapped so another soldier could live. Letters surfaced from families, describing the handwritten notes Sarah had sent to the loved ones of those who did not make it home. "She wrote me after my brother died," one woman posted, attaching a photograph of a letter. "I didn't even know her. She wrote me. She told me my brother died with honor. She told me I wasn't alone. Who does that? Who takes the time? She did." Each story reframed Sarah not as a statistic, not as a headline, but as flesh and blood, courage and sacrifice. The narrative shifted from just a soldier to the soldier. Not a symbol, not an abstract. She was the embodiment of service, of sacrifice, of what the oath was meant to mean. The hashtag trended globally. It I served with Sarah feeds, carrying stories of dusty battlefields, of shared rations, of laughter in the dark, of terror survived because Sarah was there. Veterans who had been silent for years found their voices again, compelled to speak, compelled to bear witness. The contrast with the leaked chats was brutal. On one side, officers sneering discount G.I. Jane. On the other, comrades swearing, "She saved me. She saved us. She saved lives." The receipts of betrayal were complete. Training tapes, chats, denials exposed, truths revealed, and now the testimonies of those who had lived because of her. The story could no longer be framed as confusion. It could no longer be painted as escalation. The betrayal was too clear, too documented, too undeniable. Sarah's life and Sarah's death had collided in a way that left the nation with no middle ground. Eden, still silent, still holding her mother's phone, had no idea yet how wide her mother's name had spread. But outside the walls of her grief, a movement was forming, a chorus rising. It was no longer about whether Sarah was right to stand tall. It was about what it meant that she had to die for doing so. The first real fracture in the system came not from protesters, not from politicians, but from within law enforcement itself. Captain Miguel Herrera, a decorated officer with 25 years on the force, stood before a sea of microphones. His jaw was tight, his uniform immaculate, but his hands trembled as he reached into his pocket. Cameras zoomed in as he pulled out his badge, its silver edges glinting beneath the harsh lights. For a long moment, he said nothing, staring at the badge as if it carried the weight of every decision, every compromise, every oath he had once believed in. Then his voice broke the silence. "You can't ask men to bleed for a flag you shoot at." The words cut through the air, heavy and devastating. Gasps rippled through the crowd of reporters. Some instinctively scribbled, others simply froze, their pens hovering. Herrera placed the badge on the podium with deliberate care. "I can't wear this anymore," he said. "Not after Sarah." Then he stepped away, leaving it behind. The footage played across the nation within minutes. For years, Herrera had been respected as a by-the-book officer, a man who trained recruits, who spoke about honor and discipline. His resignation was a blow to the department's credibility that no press release could patch. Inside precincts, the reaction was split. Older officers cursed him, calling him a traitor. Younger officers watched the footage and saw something else, a man refusing to drown in the tide of denial. For many, his words confirmed what they had whispered in locker rooms and squad cars, but never dared to say aloud. The oath meant nothing if the badge was used as a weapon against the very people it claimed to protect. In military circles, Herrera's words struck an even deeper chord. Soldiers shared the clip alongside stories of Sarah, linking the courage of a veteran to the courage of a captain who refused to hide behind excuses. For families of service members, his resignation was a gesture of solidarity that pierced through the noise of pundits and political spin. By nightfall, the footage had been replayed millions of times. Some called him a coward for walking away. Others called him the first honest cop they had seen in decades. But no one could ignore him. His badge, resting on that podium, had become a symbol. A badge laid down, not because the fight was over, but because he could no longer be part of a war against the truth. If Herrera's resignation cracked the facade, the collapse began in the police union. For decades, the union had been a fortress, shielding officers from accountability, defending even the indefensible. But the death of Sarah Monroe was a fault line too wide to paper over. The debate was fierce and public. In one closed-door meeting, shouts echoed through the union hall. Older representatives slammed their fists on tables, demanding full defense for the shooter. "We back the badge, no exceptions," one barked. But younger officers rose in defiance. "Not this time. Not when it's her." Whispers leaked out, then recordings. The public heard the fracture themselves. A younger officer's voice rang clear. "If we defend this, we have no soul left." The phrase struck like a hammer, spreading across social media, replayed again and again. The spectacle spilled into the open. Reporters camped outside the hall as officers walked in and out, avoiding cameras, some stone-faced, others visibly shaken. The union tried to project unity, but cracks widened daily. Some local chapters issued their own statements condemning the shooting, directly contradicting leadership. Others threatened to pull out entirely. The spectacle became a national talking point. News anchors replayed the internal audio against a backdrop of Sarah's photograph. Analysts pointed to the rare fracture as evidence of how deep the betrayal had struck. Commentators noted that the schism wasn't just political, it was generational. The old guard clung to silence and protection. The new generation, many of whom had served alongside veterans in the military before becoming police, could not stomach defending the indefensible. The public devoured the spectacle. On one side were officers who believed in absolute loyalty to the badge. On the other were those who insisted loyalty meant nothing without honor. The split was no longer hidden. It was televised, debated, dissected. For Sarah's family, the union's fracture was both vindication and torment. Vindication because the truth was undeniable. Torment because the same voices who mocked her in private were still clawing for protection. Eden, still silent, still holding her mother's folded flag, became the face of the question everyone asked. Who would the system defend, the badge or the woman who died wearing her nation's uniform? As institutions splintered, academics, journalists, and veterans began to treat Sarah's final stand as something larger than a tragedy. The live stream had already been shared millions of times, but now it was being studied, quoted, dissected. Professors called it the most important 2 minutes since Selma. Scholars wrote essays declaring it an artifact, a document of history that revealed both the brutality of prejudice and the resilience of courage. Panels of journalists replayed the clip frame by frame, analyzing not just Sarah's words but the silence that followed, the weight in her stance, the calm that refused to break. One veteran-turned-analyst said, through tears, that wasn't defiance, that was devotion. She was still serving even as they raised their weapons. Veterans framed the video as sacred text. They described it as a testament to the oath, the kind of living proof that could outlast monuments and speeches. For them, it was not just viral content. It was scripture, written in courage and blood. In universities, students marched with screens playing the clip on repeat, holding up signs that read, "Never again," and "She served." Professors wove it into lectures about civil rights, war, and justice. Activists used it as the rallying centerpiece for demonstrations across the country. For families, the video became proof against denial. No narrative could erase what millions had already seen. No spin could undo the power of Sarah's steady voice declaring her service in the face of contempt. The live stream had become more than evidence, it had become artifact. Meanwhile, Mayor Richard Kane scrambled. Once known as a careful politician, Kane had hoped to frame the shooting as an isolated incident, but every press conference backfired. His words about individual mistakes clashed against a growing chorus calling his city ground zero of betrayal. National networks broadcast images of him dodging questions, his face drawn, his tone desperate. Each attempt to calm the fire only fueled it. His calculations, downplay, delay, deny, fell apart in real time. His city was no longer just a place on a map. It was the symbol of a nation's fracture, the place where the badge outgunned the oath, the place where betrayal had been caught on tape. Through all of this, Eden remained silent. She sat in the courtroom during hearings, a folded flag in her hands, her face composed but unreadable. Cameras captured her stillness, the way she refused to cry on cue, the way she refused to play into anyone's narrative. The clip of her sitting there spread like wildfire. She didn't speak, didn't shout, didn't hold a sign. She simply held the folded flag, the same one handed to her at the ceremony for her mother. The silence was devastating. Commentators called it the quietest protest. Viewers shared the clip millions of times. Some said her silence spoke louder than any chant. Others described it as unbearable, the kind of stillness that forced people to confront the weight of what had been lost. The folded flag became its own kind of indictment. It was not just cloth, it was proof of service, proof of sacrifice, proof that Sarah had given everything and still been mocked, still been killed. Artists painted murals of Eden with the flag. Poets wrote verses about her silence. Activists carried folded flags at marches, raising them above crowds as symbols of both mourning and defiance. The imagery spread far beyond the city, reaching capitals, campuses, even foreign newspapers. Eden had not asked to lead, she had not spoken, but her silence filled the vacuum left by failed officials and broken institutions. She embodied the question that no one could escape. What does it mean to honor service if the nation turns its weapons on those who gave it everything? By the time the clip circled the globe, it was no longer just about one girl or one city. Eden's silence had become a mirror, reflecting back the fractures in the system, forcing the nation to see itself. The quiet was impossible to ignore. And in that silence, the cracks in the system widened into something deeper, something irreversible. The congressional chamber was hushed as retired General William Dalton took the stand. Cameras clicked, reporters leaned forward, and even the usually restless lawmakers stilled. Dalton was a man whose name still carried weight in military circles, a commander who had led men through fire and returned with scars both visible and unseen. Today, though, his greatest scar was invisible, carved deep into memory. Dalton adjusted the microphone, his hands steady despite the gravity of the moment. He cleared his throat and began not with statistics or policy, but with a story. "Her name was Sarah Monroe," he said, his voice resonant, "and she saved my life in Syria." The room shifted, heads lifted, cameras zoomed, and the silence grew sharper. Dalton described the night of an ambush, the chaos of mortar fire, and the sudden roar of an explosion. He painted the image of soldiers pinned down, bleeding, hopeless. "I was trapped," he said, "my leg broken, men falling all around me. And then she came." He spoke of Sarah crawling through fire, dragging him out despite shrapnel tearing into her own body. He recalled her hand steadying him, her voice whispering, "You're going home, sir." Dalton paused, his eyes clouding. "She carried me, bleeding, half-conscious, to safety. I lived because of her. Countless others did too." Then he reached into his pocket. The chamber held its breath as he placed a small, worn badge on the table before him. It was not a police badge. It was his own brass insignia, tarnished with age. "Honor died before she did," he said softly, but the words carried like thunder. When men with badges aimed their weapons at her, they weren't just killing Sarah Monroe. They were killing what she stood for. They were killing what she stood for. They were killing what she... Gasps rippled across the room. Senators shifted uncomfortably, some wiping their eyes, others stone-faced. Dalton's words were not accusation, they were elegy. He did not shout, he did not rage. He simply told the truth, and in doing so he stripped away the defenses that officials had tried to build. Outside the chamber, the testimony spread like wildfire. News outlets broadcast clips on loop, splicing Dalton's trembling voice with images of Sarah's folded flag in Eden's hands. Social media exploded with hashtags, "Honor before authority," "Dalton said it," "Honor died." Soldiers who had served under Dalton shared their own stories, describing Sarah as the soldier who never flinched, the one who gave everything. For the public, Dalton's testimony shifted the narrative again. This was no longer about isolated officers or politics. It was about the very meaning of service. And in that meaning, Sarah stood taller than any badge, any uniform, any excuse. If Dalton's testimony cracked open the chamber, the voices that followed tore through the nation's heart. Military families, usually quiet, suddenly filled the airwaves. Mothers of soldiers, some with trembling hands clutching photographs, appeared on live television. Their grief was not abstract, it was personal, urgent, unfiltered. One mother, her son still deployed overseas, wept openly as cameras rolled. "If you can't protect her, you can't protect them," she said, holding up a photo of her boy in uniform. Her voice broke, but her words seared through living rooms across the country. Another mother leaned on her husband's shoulder, whispering, "She carried sons like ours to safety. Who carried her?" These broadcasts became impossible to ignore. News anchors fell silent as these women spoke, offering no interruptions, no follow-up questions, just space for the raw truth to echo. Viewers saw tears falling onto medals, onto folded flags, onto the faces of women who had given the nation their children and now questioned what that nation truly valued. Rallies began forming outside military bases. Families gathered with signs that read, "Protect those who protect us," and "If not her, then who?" In towns across America, veterans' halls opened their doors for vigils. People lit candles beside Sarah's picture, whispering prayers, singing hymns, saluting her memory. The response rattled policymakers. Military leaders, usually careful to avoid public displays of discontent, quietly admitted that morale had never been lower. For soldiers still serving, Sarah's death was a reminder that their sacrifice might not be honored when they came home. For families, it was a betrayal that cut to the bone. Eden's silence added to the weight. Clips of her sitting in the courtroom, holding the folded flag, were replayed side by side with mothers pleading on television. The contrast was devastating. Eden represented the child left behind. These mothers represented the children still at risk. Together, they formed a chorus that no politician could mute. Within days, the voices of these mothers had become the moral center of the debate. Their tears spoke louder than press conferences, their grief heavier than policy debates, and the nation listened because they embodied a truth too painful to deny. If Sarah Monroe could be killed in uniform, then no soldier's sacrifice was safe from being erased. The reckoning spread to unexpected arenas. At an NFL game broadcast nationwide, the moment arrived. Veterans marched onto the field carrying a massive screen. The opening notes of the national anthem rang out. But instead of the usual flag display, the screen lit up with Sarah's live stream. Her calm face, her final words, her steady stance against betrayal. All played as the anthem echoed through the stadium. The effect was electric. Tens of thousands of fans, players, and officials froze in stunned silence. On the sidelines, athletes bowed their heads, some dropping to one knee, others standing rigid, tears streaking their faces. The camera panned across the stadium, capturing the sea of people united not in spectacle, but in sorrow and reverence. No one sang, no one moved. The anthem continued, but the sound of voices was replaced by silence and sobs. By the time the final notes faded, the entire stadium had become a memorial, a vast cathedral of grief and defiance. Television commentators, usually quick to analyze, choked back their own emotions. "This may be the most powerful anthem ceremony in American history," one whispered, his voice breaking. The broadcast reverberated far beyond the field. Social media erupted with clips of players crying, veterans saluting the screen, children holding flags against their hearts. Millions shared the video with captions like, "This is what respect looks like," and "She was the anthem." The ceremony shifted something intangible. The anthem, long a symbol of unity and pride, was transformed into a plea for accountability. Sarah's face, projected larger than life, became inseparable from the nation's song. From that day forward, every anthem carried a shadow, a reminder of the soldier who had been betrayed at home. For many, it was the moment the debate stopped being political and became personal. It was no longer about policies or positions. It was about what it meant to stand, to kneel, to honor. And Sarah's memory towered above it all, a reminder that true patriotism was not about blind loyalty to authority, but about fidelity to those who gave everything. The ripples spread across the globe. Soldiers stationed overseas gathered in makeshift mess halls, watching Sarah's clip on projectors and laptops. They stood in silence, saluted, and, in some cases, broke down weeping. For them, the betrayal was not just a story from home. It was a wound that crossed oceans. NATO allies issued statements of concern. Leaders in Europe and Asia spoke of Sarah by name, framing her death as a test of America's moral standing. If the strongest nation cannot protect its own heroes, what does it mean for the world? One diplomat asked bluntly. Foreign newspapers published editorials, pairing Sarah's story with images of global protests, connecting her to a broader struggle against systemic injustice. In capitals across the globe, demonstrators held signs that read "Justice for Sarah Monroe" in multiple languages. Her name had crossed borders, her story resonating with those who had seen similar betrayals in their own nations. But perhaps the most piercing echo came from a pulpit. Reverend Elijah Moore, a preacher known for blending theology with fierce activism, delivered a sermon that would spread across the world. Standing before a packed congregation, he raised Sarah's folded flag in one hand and declared, "The bullet wasn't aimed at her body, it was aimed at memory." He paused, letting the words settle. They wanted to erase her courage, to turn her into nothing more than another victim. But memory is stronger than bullets. Memory will outlive the badge, the gun, the lie. And memory will raise her higher than any power that tried to bury her. The clip of his sermon went viral. Within hours, it was translated into multiple languages, reshared by activists, soldiers, mothers, and leaders worldwide. His words became a mantra, a rallying cry that fused grief with defiance. The bullet had tried to silence Sarah, but memory had turned her into something indestructible. For Eden, watching from the shadows, the sermon cut deep. She had lived the memory every day, holding it in silence. Now the world carried it with her. She was no longer alone in bearing the weight of her mother's story. The memory was now weaponized, not for violence, but for truth. As the echoes of Reverend Moore's words circled the globe, it became clear that Sarah Monroe's death was no longer contained within a city, a courtroom, or even a nation. Her story had become a global indictment, a mirror held up to authority everywhere. And in that mirror, the struggle between honor and authority was laid bare for the world to see. The Senate Oversight Committee chamber was packed beyond capacity. Rows of cameras pointed toward the dais, their red lights blinking like watchful eyes. Journalists filled every seat, scribbling furiously, knowing that the hearings had become more than political theater. They were now the center stage of a nation's grief. The committee chair rapped his gavel sharply. "This hearing will come to order." His voice carried a practiced authority, but the tremor underneath betrayed the tension. The room smelled of sweat and stale coffee, the kind of scent that clung to long hours of evasion and questioning. The first witnesses were officials, police chiefs, union representatives, city attorneys. They shuffled papers and cleared throats, their answers wrapped in polished caution. Each avoided the blade of accountability with words like pending investigation and internal review. When pressed about why officers had confronted Sarah Monroe that night, one chief replied, "Protocol dictated their response." Senators leaned forward. Protocol? She was unarmed, she was in uniform, she was one of your own. The chief looked down, his lips tight, but offered no real answer. Another official spoke of systemic pressures and the challenges of real-time judgment. Their tone was clinical, rehearsed, designed to create fog instead of clarity. As the hours dragged, frustration built. Families in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, veterans shook their heads, and murmurs spread like brushfire. The public, watching on screens across the country, recognized the pattern. Authority was circling wagons again, trying to wait out outrage with procedure. Then came a pause in the hearing. The chair announced, "We will now hear from the families." The room straightened. Reporters lifted cameras higher. This was the moment people had waited for. The part where grief would step into the arena of power. At first, several relatives testified, quiet voices filled with tears, describing Sarah's courage, her service, her loss. Their words were heartfelt, yet the officials on the panel sat with stiff faces, unmoved. It was as though they believed the hearing would follow the usual arc. Families grieve, officials nod, then everything fades. But the chamber had not yet seen its final witness. As the chair shuffled papers and prepared to call recess, a small figure rose from the gallery. Eden Monroe, just 11 years old, stepped forward. The room froze. Senators blinked, unsure. Even the chair hesitated before nodding silently, granting her the floor. Eden's steps were slow, deliberate. She wore a simple black dress, her hair tied back neatly, her shoes just slightly too big for her small frame. Clutched in her hand was an object wrapped in cloth. The camera zoomed, the crowd hushed, and even the officials who had spent the day dodging questions suddenly looked uneasy. Something was about to break. Eden climbed onto the witness seat with the help of an aide, her feet dangling inches above the floor. She unwrapped the cloth, revealing her mother's blood-stained badge. The sight was devastating. The silver glinted under the harsh lights, tarnished with dried red that no amount of cleaning could erase. A collective gasp rippled through the chamber. Eden placed the badge gently on the desk in front of her. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched, filling every corner of the room, pressing against the chests of senators and spectators alike. The chair leaned forward, his voice softer than it had been all day. "Take your time, sweetheart." Eden's small hands gripped the microphone. She leaned in, her voice quiet but steady. "My mom didn't get forgiven," she whispered. The words cut through the chamber like glass. Her eyes scanned the panel of officials, her gaze too sharp for someone so young. Why should he? The room erupted, not in noise, but in shock. Senators who had faced down presidents sat speechless. Reporters forgot to take notes. Veterans in the gallery saluted instinctively, as if the words themselves carried the force of command. Cameras captured the moment from every angle. Eden's solemn face, the badge glistening under the lights, the officials staring as if stripped bare. It was not a testimony prepared by lawyers or written in advance. It was a child's unfiltered truth, a truth too piercing to be deflected. Her words reverberated instantly. Within minutes, clips of Eden's whisper spread across social media. On phones, laptops, and televisions, billions of eyes watched her lower her gaze after speaking, watched the senators shift in their seats, watched the badge lie heavy on the desk. Headlines blazed across every outlet, the closing argument America needed. A child's whisper that shook Washington. She asked one question and the nation couldn't answer. Late-night hosts abandoned humor. News anchors choked back tears. Commentators agreed for once. This moment would never be forgotten. In classrooms, teachers played the clip, telling students, "This is history." In workplaces, employees stopped what they were doing to gather around screens. In living rooms, families cried together, some reaching for their own folded flags, others holding their children tighter. The badge became a symbol. The image replayed endlessly. It was no longer just Sarah's badge. It was the badge of every soldier betrayed, every officer dishonored, every oath broken. And Eden, with her small voice and steady hands, had turned it into an indictment greater than any lawmaker's speech could deliver. That night, the streets outside the Capitol swelled with people holding candles. They weren't chanting, they weren't shouting, they were silent as Eden had been, holding up photographs, badges, and folded flags. The silence itself became the protest, as powerful as any roar. And in that silence, one truth rang louder than any gavel. The nation had been spoken to, not by its leaders, but by a child who had already lost too much. The reverberations of Eden's words did not stop in Washington. In military barracks thousands of miles away, soldiers crowded around screens to watch the clip. Some sat on bunks with heads bowed. Others stood at attention, saluting the badge on the desk as though saluting Sarah herself. Tears fell freely. One young private whispered, "I'd follow her into battle," and chat threads across bases picked up the line until it became a refrain. Veterans forums overflowed with emotion. Posts appeared that read, "We've marched behind generals. Today, we'd march behind her." Others wrote, "She is her mother's daughter." Soldiers who had long suppressed their grief found release in Eden's defiance, feeling as though her question had spoken for them all. The political world was equally shaken. Senators huddled in back rooms late into the night. Some spoke of the impossibility of ignoring her words. Others confessed that no bill, no statement, no press release could match the moral force of a child asking why forgiveness should apply to killers but not to her mother. By dawn, drafts of new legislation began circulating. Proposals for sweeping reform of police accountability, protections for military families, and oversight mechanisms appeared overnight. The same lawmakers who had dodged responsibility for years now found themselves racing to align with the tide of public outrage. One senator, leaving the chamber after hours of closed-door negotiations, paused before reporters. His voice cracked as he said, "That girl did more in one sentence than we've done in decades." The clip of his statement spread almost as widely as Eden's own words, becoming a grim acknowledgement of political failure. The shockwave extended into cultural spaces as well. Artists painted murals of Eden holding the badge. Poets wrote verses titled, "Why Should He?" Musicians sampled her words into songs that climbed the charts, blending grief with defiance. Churches, mosques, and synagogues played the clip during services, treating it as both testimony and scripture. For Eden herself, the aftermath was overwhelming. She returned home with relatives, shielded from cameras, but the nation's gaze followed her. Letters poured in, thousands of them, from strangers thanking her for her courage, from children sending drawings of badges and flags, from soldiers addressing her as Commander Eden. Yet even in her quiet, the ripple continued. Eden had not just spoken for her mother, she had spoken for a nation grappling with betrayal, demanding to know why authority demanded forgiveness for itself while offering none to those it had wronged. In the weeks that followed, every hearing, every rally, every political debate carried the echo of her words. Her whisper had become the nation's conscience, a question that would not be buried. And so, the child who had once sat in silence, clutching a folded flag, had risen to the microphone and, with one unanswerable question, changed the course of history. The Pentagon was not known for silence, but the memo that circulated one early morning carried with it a quiet that rattled even the most hardened generals. It was stamped with the seal of the Department of Defense, classified at the highest level. Yet word of its existence spread through the ranks like a ghost moving through corridors. The title on the front page was chilling in its simplicity: Event Zero. Inside, the language was stripped of the usual bureaucratic padding. No legal jargon, no hedging, no elaborate citations. Just one line at the top: "We do not make recommendations. The truth has already done that." The memo referenced the now legendary live stream of Sarah Monroe's final moments, Eden's testimony before the Senate Oversight Committee, and the worldwide reaction that followed. It was unlike anything the Pentagon had ever produced, an acknowledgement not only of grief but of institutional betrayal. The body of the memo was direct. It stated that the military would not stand idle in the face of unlawful aggression, even if such aggression came from civilian law enforcement. It did not declare open conflict. It did not suggest rebellion, but it did draw a line in history. Soldiers were authorized to adopt a defensive posture if confronted, and units were instructed to report any incidents immediately to the highest chain of command. The memo was given a code name: Event Zero. It was chosen carefully, a signal that this was not merely a reaction to Sarah's death, but the beginning of something new. Event Zero was not a policy. It was a marker, a recognition that the old contract between the nation's guardians and its civilian protectors had been broken. For decades, the military and police had been aligned, overlapping in ceremony and respect, but now the Pentagon was admitting, in writing, that trust had collapsed. The first to receive the memo were commanders stationed abroad. Some read it with relief, others with dread. One colonel stationed in Germany whispered to his staff, "It's come to this. We are preparing for defense not against foreign enemies, but against our own." The weight of those words pressed heavily on every soldier who heard them. Back in Washington, a few high-ranking officials sat in a closed room, reading the memo in silence. One general finally spoke, "This isn't just policy, this is doctrine." Another nodded gravely, "No, it's history." They knew that once the memo leaked, and it inevitably would, America would not be the same. The Pentagon had not fired a shot, it had not raised a flag of rebellion, but in the halls of power it had drawn a silent but immovable line, and in doing so it declared that Sarah Monroe's blood had shifted the foundation of authority itself. The leak came 3 days later, not through an official channel but through a single page slipped to a journalist at a late-night diner. The reporter, known for chasing shadows others ignored, stared at the document in disbelief. Event Zero was written across the top in bold. The lines beneath were stark, clinical, terrifying. Within hours, the memo appeared online. Screenshots spread like wildfire. Social media erupted with disbelief, then with fury. Headlines screamed, "Military memo reveals rift with civilian police." Event Zero, Pentagon no longer trusts local law enforcement. A line has been crossed. The implications were staggering. For generations, Americans had been told that soldiers and police stood side by side as brothers in uniform. Now the truth was out. The military no longer believed the police could be trusted to uphold the same standard of honor. It was not just a scandal, it was a fracture in the bedrock of the nation's identity. The leak sent shockwaves through barracks and precincts alike. Soldiers texted each other late into the night, "We knew it was coming. It's official now." Police unions scrambled to respond, insisting the memo was being misinterpreted. But the document's words were unambiguous. The trust was gone, and it had been shattered not by politics, but by a child holding a blood-stained badge. Crowds gathered outside the Pentagon demanding clarity. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, holding signs that read, "Event Zero equals truth." In cities across the country, police departments faced new waves of protests, not just against brutality, but against legitimacy itself. The public wanted answers. If the military no longer trusted the police, why should the people? Inside the Pentagon, officials debated the fallout. Some argued that the leak had endangered national security. Others countered that the leak had only confirmed what everyone already felt in their bones, that the institutions meant to protect had turned into instruments of fear. One young officer said quietly, "The truth isn't the threat, the lie was." Meanwhile, symbols began to take shape. In the Hall of Honor within the Pentagon, where relics of sacrifice were displayed under glass, a new artifact was placed without fanfare: Sarah Monroe's blood-stained uniform patch. No plaque, no inscription. Just a single piece of fabric preserved in silence. Visitors who passed the case stopped instinctively, removing hats, bowing heads, or simply standing still. The patch said more than any speech could. Reporters who toured the Hall of Honor noted how the patch had drawn more attention than the medals of famous generals or the flags from historic battles. "It's the most powerful display in the building," one wrote, "because it does not celebrate victory, it mourns honor." As photographs of the display spread, the patch became a global icon. Soldiers around the world printed images of it on banners, t-shirts, even tattoos. It was no longer just Sarah's patch. It was the emblem of Event Zero, the moment when silence spoke louder than power. Rituals began almost immediately. At West Point, cadets were ordered to write essays on the theme, "Obedience versus Honor." Professors reported that the papers were unlike any they had ever read. Some cadets confessed their fear of defying orders. Others declared that honor must outweigh authority at any cost. One essay began with the line, "If I obey without honor, I have already betrayed my oath." Copies of these essays leaked online, fueling even more debate. Parents of cadets wrote letters of pride and worry, while veterans sent messages of encouragement. The military was not just training soldiers anymore, it was training moral philosophers, forced to grapple with the questions Sarah's death had carved into the nation's conscience. Across bases worldwide, soldiers began holding 1 minute of silence each morning before duty. No order had mandated it, it simply started in one unit and spread like wildfire. At first, it was for Sarah. Soon, it was for all who had fallen unjustly. In Afghanistan, Iraq, Germany, Korea, soldiers stood in perfect silence at sunrise, heads bowed, remembering not just their own comrades, but the idea of honor itself. Families adopted the ritual too. In living rooms across America, parents gathered their children each morning before school, turned off the television, and stood in silence for 60 seconds. Churches rang bells, schools paused announcements. Even professional sports teams adopted the ritual before games. The silence was no longer just remembrance, it was resistance. Media outlets began referring to the movement as the Honor Minute. It was covered daily, shown in split screens of soldiers in desert camps, families in kitchens, crowds in stadiums. The images spoke of unity born not from slogans, but from silence. And always, somewhere in the footage, the patch appeared. Projected on jumbotrons, printed on posters, carried in wallets. But the most haunting rituals unfolded quietly. Soldiers deployed overseas began saluting the screen whenever Eden's clip was replayed. Veterans, some in wheelchairs, saluted photographs of Sarah taped to their walls. And in military academies, cadets recited Eden's words, "My mom didn't get forgiven, why should he?" as though they were lines from a sacred text. The Pentagon tried to downplay the movement, calling it a temporary expression of grief, but it was not temporary, it was transformation. Event Zero had become not just a memo, but a way of life. It had redefined the bond between soldier and nation, between obedience and conscience. In the end, the rituals made one truth undeniable. Sarah Monroe had not lived to see her daughter's words echo in chambers of power, nor to see her patch enshrined under glass. But through the silence, through the essays, through the defiance that spread from one uniform to another, she had achieved what no doctrine, no policy, no general had ever achieved before. She had turned death into a living command, honor first, authority second. And with that command, Event Zero was no longer just a memo. It was history's pivot point. The congressional hearing on Hollow Creek was meant to be a formality, a routine examination of municipal practices, but by the time Mayor Richard Kane took his seat, the chamber felt less like a forum and more like a courtroom. Cameras crowded every corner. Senators adjusted microphones, flipping through thick binders stacked with years of neglected oversight reports. Across the country, televisions hummed to life, broadcasting the hearing live. Everyone knew this was not just about Hollow Creek anymore. It was about whether justice still had a pulse in America. Mayor Kane tried to present himself with authority, his tie perfectly knotted, his prepared remarks neatly stacked. But his eyes betrayed the weight of what he carried, the knowledge that his decisions, or indecisions, had led to the moment when Sarah Monroe bled in the street while his city's officers stood complicit. When the first senator leaned forward, the questions came like hammer blows. "Mr. Kane, do you deny that under your administration, at least 53 civilian complaints against Hollow Creek officers were dismissed without investigation?" The mayor shifted in his chair, stammering, We didn't have the resources. Our oversight board was understaffed, underfunded." The senator cut him off sharply. "You had one job. One, to make sure the people of your city could live without fear of their own police, and you failed." The chamber fell into silence. Even the hum of cameras seemed to pause. Mayor Kane's lips trembled as he reached for the papers in front of him, flipping through them as though an answer might be hiding between the lines. His voice faltered. "We believed our officers acted in good faith." Another senator slammed the table. "Good faith does not explain ignoring patterns of brutality. Good faith does not explain why Sarah Monroe, an Army officer, was left bleeding without accountability. Good faith is not governance, it is cowardice." The mayor blinked hard, sweat gathering along his forehead. The pressure of the lights, the eyes of the nation, the knowledge that Eden's face had become a symbol larger than any flag, everything pressed down on him at once. He muttered again, "We didn't have resources." This time the committee chair leaned forward, her voice measured but cutting. Mr. Kane, the people didn't ask you for excuses. They asked you for leadership. And when it mattered most, you looked away. The line landed like a verdict. For a moment, even Kane himself seemed to shrink, as if acknowledging what had already become clear to everyone watching. He was no longer a mayor, but a symbol of surrender, a man who had abandoned his duty. The hearing pressed on, question after question, exposing numbers, timelines, ignored memos. Each statistic was a nail in the coffin of his reputation. By the end of the first hour, it was no longer a hearing. It was a dismantling. When the hearing adjourned, the reaction outside was immediate. Crowds had gathered beyond the barricades, waving placards, chanting, holding candles in silent vigils. Reporters rushed to broadcast breaking headlines: Mayor Kane crumbles under fire. Congressional panel exposes Hollow Creek failure. But the true blow came from the citizens themselves. Overnight, social media lit up with one rallying cry: "Her blood, your badge." The phrase appeared on posters, digital banners, and projected across city buildings. It was painted on sidewalks in red chalk, carried by high school students during walkouts, scrawled across murals that seemed to rise from concrete overnight. For once, the chant was not directed at a faceless system. It was aimed directly at Kane, the man who had let silence fester into violence. At a town square vigil, an elderly woman raised her voice to the crowd. "My grandson was beaten by Hollow Creek police 3 years ago. We begged the mayor to listen. He said there wasn't enough proof. Well, now we have proof in blood." The crowd roared in agreement, voices echoing through the night air. Inside City Hall, the walls closed in on Kane. His aides quit one by one, unwilling to be associated with the unraveling. Phone lines buzzed non-stop with angry calls. Council members whispered in private, drafting resolutions that would strip him of power without waiting for formal charges. It was the first time in decades that a mayor of Hollow Creek faced a no-confident vote, and it was clear how the numbers would fall. The vote was held in a packed chamber, citizens crammed shoulder to shoulder, their eyes burning with fury and grief. The council chair stood, gavel in hand, and announced, "The motion of no confidence in Mayor Richard Kane passes 11-0. Applause, cheers, and tears broke out at once. For the people, it was not just a political act. It was a declaration that they would no longer be governed by indifference. Kane sat alone in his office later that night, the city lights flickering through the blinds. He had not been charged with a crime. No handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Yet in every sense that mattered, his power was gone. He stared at the framed photograph of himself shaking hands with police chiefs, the smile now hollow. He whispered to the empty room, "I thought I was protecting them." But the truth was undeniable. He had protected the wrong people. Outside, protesters carried Eden's face on banners, alongside Sarah's patch. The imagery fused together: child, badge, and silence. And everywhere the chant rose again, not just as anger but as a promise: her blood, your badge. Out of the storm of politics and protests emerged a single image that captured the world's imagination. It was taken on the steps of the Capitol after one of the hearings. Eden, dressed in black, clutched a folded flag against her chest. She stood alone, head bowed, silent. Behind her loomed the great marble columns, but she looked small, impossibly small, framed against their weight. The photo was titled "The Triangle." At first, no one understood why, then critics explained. The child, the flag, the memory of her mother, all forming 3 points of meaning. The triangle of loss, honor, and hope. Within hours, the name stuck. Newspapers around the world splashed it across front pages. The triangle. Commentators said it was not just a photograph, it was a closing argument in itself, a symbol of a nation at a crossroads. In London, a mural appeared overnight in Brixton. Eden's silhouette painted in black, holding the folded flag, with the words "Protect those who protect" scrawled beneath. In Paris, artists projected the same image onto the side of Notre Dame during an evening vigil. In Johannesburg, children painted the triangle symbol on schoolyard walls. The phrase beneath translated into their language. The world had adopted Eden's grief as its own. Back in America, the image was everywhere. Protest signs carried it. Journalists wore pins of the triangle during broadcasts. Soldiers patched it onto their uniforms in quiet defiance. It was not government-approved, not military-issued. It was something deeper. A universal acknowledgement that Sarah's sacrifice, Eden's words, and the collapse of Cain's authority had fused into one story too powerful to be ignored. Cain watched it all unfold on television. Every mural, every chant, every broadcast drove the truth deeper into his chest. His downfall had not come from rivals or political enemies. It had come from a child standing in silence with a flag. No statement he could release, no apology he could draft, would erase the triangle. And so Hollow Creek moved forward without him. Citizens organized community councils, demanding oversight structures built not by politicians but by families and veterans who knew the weight of sacrifice. What began as local reform ignited conversations nationwide. Could communities lead where officials had failed? Could silence, embodied by a child with a folded flag, be louder than speeches from podiums? Internationally, the phrase beneath the murals, "Protect those who protect," became more than a slogan. It was written into petitions, recited in rallies and debated in parliaments. Sarah Monroe's death and Eden's testimony had transcended borders, and in that transcendence, Mayor Cain's fall became more than local disgrace. It became the cautionary tale of what happens when leaders confuse excuses with leadership, when they mistake cowardice for governance. By the end of the year, the triangle hung in homes, schools, and barracks. Eden herself never asked for the attention. She rarely spoke in public again. But her silence became the world's vocabulary, and wherever the image appeared, it whispered the same message: never again. It began quietly, without announcement or directive, without leaders standing at podiums. At noon one day in a hospital in Chicago, a group of nurses stopped what they were doing. Machines still beeped, patients still breathed, emergencies still carried on, but for 60 seconds the nurses stood shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed in absolute silence. No one told them to do it. They simply did. It was their way of honoring Sarah Monroe, their way of honoring the silence Eden had given to the world. Word spread faster than any decree could. By the following week, teachers in Los Angeles stood before classrooms at noon, chalk resting against blackboards, students watching in confusion until the first teacher explained, "This is for her." Soon enough, students followed, desks stilled, pencils resting as 1 minute stretched into a language no book had ever taught them. Firefighters in Boston stepped outside their station, helmets tucked under their arms, trucks idle, and for 1 minute they too stood with heads bowed. The pattern took root in every profession. At noon, across time zones, across shifts, workers set down their tools. Farmers in Iowa, chefs in New Orleans, machinists in Detroit, all froze for 60 seconds. Even police departments, under the scrutiny of reform and investigation, found themselves standing in silence. For many it was uncomfortable, even awkward, but for others it was the first time they had stood still and acknowledged the cost of what silence had taken. The ritual was never codified, never ordered by law. It was passed in whispers, in online posts, in texts between friends. At noon, we stop. Soon, the silence wasn't just an American gesture. Videos poured in, from Seoul, from Nairobi, from Rio de Janeiro. Teachers in South Africa stood in silence. Doctors in Italy halted surgeries for exactly 60 seconds, monitors beeping steadily in rhythm. In Tokyo, subway conductors opened their doors, bowed to waiting passengers, and stood in silence before resuming their routes. Commentators struggled to explain it. Was it protest? Was it mourning? Was it ritual? In truth, it was all of those at once. The silence wasn't about punishment or even politics anymore. It had become a shared breath across humanity. a recognition that Sarah's sacrifice had lit a candle too bright to extinguish. For 1 minute every day, the world remembered. And in remembering, the world changed. Eden, shielded by relatives from much of the media storm, saw it once on television. She watched footage of thousands standing silent in Times Square, the traffic lights changing, but no one moving. She turned to her guardian and whispered, "That's the same silence I heard after Mom fell." In her words, the ritual found its deepest meaning. It was no longer just silence, it was memory given form. In the wake of this growing ritual, another movement emerged, one that pulled veterans from every corner of the nation toward Hollow Creek. They came alone, in pairs, in convoys of motorcycles that roared across highways before falling silent at their destination. They were not there for speeches. They came carrying their own history. Some brought medals pinned to velvet. Some brought folded letters yellowed with age. Some brought the weight of dog tags that had once hung over the hearts of fallen brothers and sisters. At the memorial site for Sarah Monroe, the offerings gathered like a flood. Bronze plaques leaned against stone walls. Photographs of soldiers in uniform lined the base of the monument. Boots weathered by sand and war sat side by side. One veteran, her hands trembling, removed her silver star from her jacket and placed it carefully on the steps. "She deserves it more," she whispered. Cameras captured her words, and the clip circled the world in hours. The pilgrimage became continuous. Veterans who had once marched into Baghdad or patrolled the mountains of Afghanistan now marched into Hollow Creek with nothing but silence and tribute. They spoke little, often not at all. Instead, they wrote notes. For Sarah, who fought in a different kind of war. For Eden, who carries the weight of us all. For those who bled without armor. Soon the site itself could not contain the weight of their offerings. The memorial became a living archive of sacrifice, where each item told a story. Children on school trips wandered past the medals and dog tags, teachers explaining softly, "These are not decorations, they are promises." Families knelt, parents lifting toddlers so they could place flowers among the metal and paper. The symbolism struck deep. For years, veterans had asked what their sacrifices meant when injustice reigned at home. Now they had an answer. Their silence, their offerings, their presence transformed the Hollow Creek Memorial into sacred ground. The pilgrimage wasn't only about Sarah anymore. It was about reclaiming honor from a system that had betrayed them, about reminding the nation that those who swore to protect must themselves be protected. The images of veterans saluting in silence became iconic. Newspapers published them side by side with the triangle photograph of Eden. Commentators wrote, "This is what national unity looks like. Not slogans, not campaigns, but medals laid down in humility." The pilgrimages grew so large that even airlines offered discounted flights for veterans traveling to Hollow Creek. It was no longer just a town. It had become a destination of conscience. And still, through it all, Eden remained quiet. She visited once, standing before the sea of medals, her small hand clutching her mother's folded flag. She did not cry, she simply bowed her head. Those who witnessed it said it was the most profound silence yet. As the silence deepened into culture, music began to follow. Choirs across the country gathered in churches, schools, and public squares, singing the national anthem not with words but with humming. The sound was haunting, familiar yet stripped of its boastful lyrics. The melody floated through rafters and stadiums, soft at first, then swelling as voices joined. No one sang of rockets or bombs, instead they hummed of memory and loss. At first, it was local choirs. Then professional orchestras adopted the practice, performing symphonies in silence, with movements carried only by humming and strings. The effect was chilling, as though the music itself mourned. Sports stadiums joined next. Before football games and baseball matches, tens of thousands hummed the anthem together, the sound vibrating through bleachers, through hearts. Opposing teams stood side by side, not singing, not cheering, but humming in unison. The ritual spread worldwide. During an international soccer match in Germany, the crowd of 80,000 began humming the American anthem. Players froze mid-warm-up, tears in their eyes. In Canada, choirs stood outside Parliament and hummed until lawmakers stepped outside to listen. In Brazil, orchestras ended concerts with the hum, dedicating it not just to Sarah Monroe, but to all who had suffered at the hands of injustice. Soon, silence and humming became inseparable, a dual language that crossed every barrier. Families began to use it at home. Parents who once scolded children with stern words now looked at them softly and said, "Remember the minute." The phrase entered culture as shorthand for honor and restraint. Children understood immediately. It meant pause, reflect, act with dignity. Even corporations, often resistant to symbolism, paused meetings at noon. Boardrooms of executives bowed their heads, some sincerely, some out of necessity, but the act carried weight nonetheless. Finally, the silence reached the highest halls of power. In Washington, lawmakers gathered to pass a sweeping reform package known as the Restoration Act. For months, activists had demanded a law that would create federal oversight of police departments, strip abusive officers of immunity, and enforce transparency. The silence had given them leverage no lobbyist could match. The act was debated fiercely, amended, challenged, but in the end, it passed with overwhelming support. The signing ceremony was unlike any other. The president approached the podium, pen in hand, but before signing, she set it down. "This is not about me," she said. "It is about her. It is about all of them." Then she bowed her head, and for 1 minute the room fell silent. Senators, representatives, staffers, even the press lowered their heads. The silence was televised, reaching millions. When the minute ended, the president picked up her pen and signed the Restoration Act into law. The law became the legislative embodiment of silence, proof that memory could reshape policy. For once, Congress acted not out of partisanship but out of obligation to a nation that had demanded it. The silence had spoken louder than shouting ever could. That night, cities lit up monuments in white light, not in celebration but in reverence. Across the nation, people stopped again at midnight, 1 more minute, as if to seal the moment. Eden, watching from home, whispered, "Mom would like this." And for the first time since her mother's fall, she smiled. 5 years had passed since the silence began. The world had changed in ways that once seemed impossible. Statues had risen in cities across the globe, not of warriors on horseback or politicians in marble robes, but of a woman holding her daughter's hand, both faces tilted toward the horizon. The Restoration Act had become law. Departments once shielded from scrutiny now answered to oversight boards, and the silence still held its place every noon. Yet perhaps the most striking change was the quiet strength of a girl who had grown into herself. Eden Monroe, now 16, stood tall in the crisp uniform of the U.S. Military Preparatory Academy. The dark blue jacket fit her like armor, the silver buttons shining in the morning light. Her hair was neatly tied back, her face older but still marked with the same gravity that had once silenced millions. She had chosen this path not out of obligation but out of resolve. Her mother had carried a badge with honor, and Eden would carry forward that spirit in her own way. The academy grounds stretched wide, an ocean of cadets standing at attention on the green field. Beyond them, cameras perched on towers, broadcast vans hummed, and helicopters circled high above. Dignitaries filled the bleachers, politicians, generals, teachers, veterans, even ordinary citizens who had traveled miles just to witness this day. All had gathered not for a ceremony of rank or tradition, but for Eden's first address. As she stepped onto the podium, the world seemed to narrow around her. The polished wood gleamed beneath her palms. Her heart raced, but her gaze was steady. She had been waiting for this moment, carrying it within her like an unspoken vow. In her jacket pocket, folded small and pressed against her chest, was the flag that had once rested in her arms when she was a child. It was worn now, its edges frayed, but it was whole, just as she was. The murmurs in the crowd quieted as she leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was soft but firm, carrying not only across the academy field, but across every television, every live stream, every device tuned in. 5 years ago, my mother's life ended in 1 minute. She paused, her throat tightening, but she continued. 1 minute was all it took for violence to strike, for silence to fall, and in that silence, the world found itself. The field was utterly still. The cadets watched her with unblinking eyes, waiting for her next words. She took a deep breath. Maybe 1 minute is also all it takes to begin restoring what was lost. Maybe 1 minute can be the difference between breaking and building, between forgetting and remembering, between silence as absence and silence as promise. Her hands gripped the podium, her voice rising. So today, I ask for one thing. I ask that we give that minute back, not to me, not just to her, but to each other. The effect was immediate. Before she could even finish her sentence, the entire field of cadets, row after row in perfectly aligned uniforms, bowed their heads. No orders were barked, no whistles blown. The silence rippled outward, natural and unforced. 1,000 bodies stilled at once, their boots rooted to the ground, their hands locked at their sides. The hush spread past the field. The generals in the front row fell silent, medals gleaming in the sun. Politicians accustomed to speeches and applause lowered their heads. Families in the bleachers stood, hands over hearts, lips pressed closed. Even the journalists, cameras poised, set down their microphones and tilted their lenses without a word. The silence was no longer just for Sarah Monroe. It was for every name lost, for every injustice survived, for every vow carried forward. Above, the helicopters slowed, hovering in place. Their rotors hummed, but even that sound seemed subdued, almost reverent. For the first time in memory, the air itself felt still. The broadcast reached into homes across the world. Millions watching from couches, offices, classrooms, and sidewalks saw the image of a girl at a podium and instinctively joined. In Paris, people stopped mid-stride on crowded streets. In Lagos, bus drivers pulled over and turned off their engines. In Sao Paulo, construction crews lowered their tools. The silence stretched on, longer than the traditional 60 seconds, but no one dared break it. Time lost its edge. It could have been 1 minute or 5. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that the silence was whole, unbroken, sacred. Eden stood motionless at the podium, her eyes closed. She didn't fidget, didn't shift her weight. The sun caught her face, warming her skin, as though the world itself bore witness to the vow she was renewing. In her mind, she heard her mother's voice, calm and strong. She remembered the way Sarah would say, "Stand tall, Eden. Even in stillness you stand tall." When the silence finally broke, it was not with cheering or shouting. It broke with a soft, collective breath, as though the world exhaled at once. The cadets lifted their heads, the crowd stirred, the helicopters resumed their slow turns, but something had been imprinted into the moment, something indelible. The silence had not ended. It had merely been carried forward into each heart, a shared oath sealed in stillness. Cameras captured every detail, Eden's hand resting lightly on the flag folded against her chest, the sun blazing over her shoulder, the cadets' faces, eyes wet with tears they did not wipe away. The crowd standing as one. Within minutes, the images surged across social media. Hashtags erupted worldwide. 1 minute. Her silence, our oath, stand for Sarah. Leaders across the globe paused their meetings to watch. The Pope stood in quiet reverence. Prime ministers, presidents, and kings stopped mid-speech, mid-debate, mid-dinner. For that moment, borders dissolved. The world was not divided into nations, but united in silence. As the live stream continued, something remarkable unfolded. Screens from New York to Nairobi to New Delhi filled with people standing silently, in living rooms, in factories, in churches and mosques. A farmer in rural India bowed his head in his field. A classroom in Johannesburg stood from their desks. A mother in Mexico held her child against her chest, whispering, "Quiet, baby." This is for her. The stillness Eden had called for had leapt oceans and languages, binding humanity together in a way no law, no speech, no battle ever could. Commentators would later say that Eden's silence became the oath of a generation, not a law written in ink, not a treaty signed in marble halls, but a vow spoken in the absence of words. A vow that power must answer to conscience, that honor must stand above cruelty, that silence would no longer mean complicity, but remembrance. When the moment ended, Eden opened her eyes and looked out across the field. She did not smile, did not cry. She simply stood, flag in hand, a still figure in the sunlight. Around her, the cadets shifted back into formation. The crowd returned to their seats, the helicopters veered away. Life resumed, but not as it had been. Something had shifted, something had closed, yet something new had begun. Later that evening, as the footage replayed across news networks, one image became the defining symbol of the day. Eden standing alone at the podium, the folded flag pressed to her chest, her silhouette framed against the blazing sky. The caption read, "Her silence became our oath." The image circled the world, printed on posters, painted on walls, carried in marches. It joined the triangle as part of the permanent visual language of remembrance. Together, the two images told a story that could not be erased. A child in mourning and a young woman in resolve. As the sun set on Hollow Creek that night, Eden sat quietly by herself. She unfolded the flag, smoothing its edges, and whispered, "We gave the minute back, Mom." She folded it again, neatly, carefully, and placed it beside her bed. The silence lingered around her, not heavy, not hollow, but alive. For years to come, people would say that the true end of the story wasn't in the outrage, or the trials, or even the laws that followed. The true end was in that field, in the silence that stretched across continents, in the stillness that spoke louder than any shout. Sometimes, they would say, stories do not end when the camera cuts. Sometimes, they begin there. And so Eva stood in sunlight, motionless, flag folded, her stillness echoing through a world that had once been broken by noise. Her silence was no longer the silence of grief. It was the silence of promise, the silence of legacy, and it was enough.